the temporal spatial dimension. Next slide. Next slide. Yeah.
Prakash, can you make them bigger? Full screen.
Okay. All right.
Okay. Yeah. Perfect. Yeah. So I give you a little bit theoretical background because that's very important to understand. Specialness versus non-specialness of consciousness, and I will tell you what it means. But my primary focus is on the mechanistic side. I present you two mechanisms of the temporal spatial theory of consciousness. Temporal spatial nestedness, it's about scale-free activity. Temporal spatial alignment is about synchronizing with the environment. And the TTC, temporal spatial theory of consciousness, also includes other mechanisms which I leave out. Next slide. One important business, I'm really speaking here about the Western tradition, not about your tradition, because I think you are not prone to the specialness of mind. Next slide, next push. Yeah, in philosophy, Western philosophy, particularly starting with Descartes in the 15th, 16th century, he said that the mind cannot be observed from the outside, like the physical body. So the mind must be something special and the body is something non-special. And interestingly, this dichotomy between special and non-special has really transferred into current neuroscience. Next slide. You see this here. So in many of the current theories of consciousness, you say there's a special mechanism like information integration on top of the ongoing activity, or a global neuronal workspace on top of the otherwise non-special neuronal activity. So they have a special neuromental mechanism as distinguished from the all other non-special neural mechanism. And that special addition makes possible consciousness. Next slide. Yeah, here is just a refined version. Yeah, I go on. Okay. Here is just a refined version of that, that the current distinction in philosophy reflect a phenomenal consciousness. Both are considered special, access phenomenal consciousness, and you see the different theories of consciousness, global neuronal workspace theory, recurrent processing theory, higher order Hort theory, or IIT, and integrated information or embodied approaches. And then beneath, you still have the non-special mechanisms going on, which are largely in charge of non-consciousness, unconscious processing, or predictive coding, free energy. So, next one. So the question is, there's always a principal difference between the neuronal mechanism underlying consciousness and the neuronal mechanism going on in the brain independent of consciousness. And that's key. So that attributes a special role, function of consciousness in the brain. That's very much the philosophical tradition. Next slide. Yeah, next slide. So here we reviewed as a paper I wrote with Victor Lammert 2020, all the different theories of consciousness. And I think basically almost all, and there's a recent review paper by Seth and Bain, all these theories are usually a special mechanism on top of the otherwise non-special processing in the brain. Next slide. Yeah, so it's exactly what I say here, neuroscience of consciousness, embedding and integrating special neuronal mechanism within the otherwise non-special neuronal features of the brain. Next one. And that's exactly the assumption, the presupposition, next one, which I challenge. Instead of differences, maybe there's a basic similarity. And that is huge consequences, which I'm sure you as Indian understand. Because if I say it is a non-special mechanism, consciousness is an intrinsic feature of the brain, meaning the brain is designed in such a way that it predisposes you to have consciousness. Yeah, so it's a phenomenon, if you want to put it even larger, of nature. So, and that's what we are looking for the similarity between the different layers of processing. Next one. So what is that? The similarity between neuronal and mental processing. Here, I present you a beautiful quote by Nikola Tesla. if you want to find the secrets of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, vibration. I'm sure that is very close to your traditions. And look up the Google link of Tesla, very interesting personality. And there's no wonder that Elon Musk, who is also a colorful personality, named his cars after this guy. So they're really similar. When you see the bio of Tesla, you see me smiling. Next one. So that's what I mean. It's really temporal spatial dynamics. And I will see later, I show you what I mean by dynamics. I see natural phenomena like waves, like music. You have a lot of dynamics. I will provide more flesh to the bones. Next one. So that's the key thing here. That's basically the last slide of the theoretical section. I say consciousness is nothing special. It's an intrinsic feature of the brain. If it's an intrinsic feature of the brain, you need to go to the basics, to the most bottom basic features of the brain, which it shares with the rest of the natural world, and that is temporal dynamic and spatial topography. And the temporal spatial theory of consciousness is about that. That it says consciousness is about temporal spatial mechanisms in the brain. And it searches and considers these spatial temporal mechanisms as commonly shared on neuronal and mental activity. So meaning when you go into consciousness, we consider consciousness and also cognition in spatial temporal terms, because it's the structuring by the brain's intrinsic spatial temporal organization. Next one. So now I gave you a little bit a larger philosophical theoretical background, and that really distinguishes the TTC, as I can see, from all other current theories of consciousness around. I may not know all the theories of consciousness in your part of the world, but in the neuroscience, Western-dominated field, I think I can clearly say this, that we say consciousness is the most basic mechanism of the brain. It is nothing special. It is really non-special. So now I come to the second point. I introduce the TTC a little bit, and then we'll put the focus and provide some empirical data on one particular mechanism, temporal spatial nestedness. Next one. Yeah, here we introduce this theory in various papers, also more recent ones. And the key thing is here, the two key assumptions of this, that we want to bridge the distinction between spontaneous and stimulus-related activity. When you look in current theories of consciousness, look just into the recent Nature Reviews Neuroscience by a paper by Sid and Bain, that's all task-evoked theories of consciousness or induced activity related. Yeah, there's not this dimension is about spontaneous activity. There are a couple of activities around, like the Cartart-Farisi entropy hypothesis, the Finkelkurz operational space and time. None of that is mentioned. So that tells you the very cognitive heritage of these approaches to consciousness. So that's a key thing for the TTC. It wants to bridge the gap between spontaneous stimulus-related activity, and you will see it offers a specific mechanism for that temporal spatial expansion. And the second thing is really intrinsically linking neuronal and phenomenal features. So what do they share? What makes, and that sharing must possible the transformation of neuronal activity into phenomenal activity. So that's the way I phrase the question distinguishes again the TTC from the other theories. Because they basically say, okay, we have phenomenal or mental activity, and then we map it onto the brain. So it's a methodologically a very top-down approach they do. Here, the TTC rather tries a bottom-up approach. It goes, what are the features in neuronal activity that make it possible to transform that activity into mental or phenomenal activity? Yeah, that's exactly the transformation like water here in Canada. You know, it can be very cold. We have transformation from ice, from fluid into vapor. So we have these, and what makes that transformation possible is specific features of the molecule H2O. And that's exactly what I'm looking for here. Yeah, so that's what the TTC highlights, and that's why we have a double hypothesis. We have first purely neuronal hypothesis, and then we have neurophenomenal hypothesis, and that these neurophenomenal features highlight those features that make that transformation possible, and I will show you some example of that. Next one. Next one. Yeah, here you provide, this is from the 2017 paper. We are going back to the brain, to the basics of the neural brain's neural activity. What does it structure? That's the spatial topography and temporal dynamic. And along those lines, the TTC postulates 4 different mechanisms: temporal spatial nestedness, temporal spatial alignment, expansion, globalization. Nestedness, I will explain you. Alignment, I will explain you. Expansion is the specific interaction between pre-stimulus, spontaneous activity, and the external input, leading to task-evoked activity. So that's where you have the phenomenal features. Here we mainly focus, also because of reasons of time, on nestedness and alignment. And you see here, it's a quite overview on this table. You see that we have 4 different features of consciousness: level, state, content, phenomenal, experience, and cognitive processing reported. And each of these 4 columns is mediated by a particular mechanism. So we have different features of consciousness, different mechanisms. So that's what I think this is also a distinction from all the other theories of consciousness that usually just assume one mechanism, one for all. One particular mechanism like integrated information, and then links that with consciousness. So the idea of the TTC is here to slice up the phenomenon without losing consciousness and the neuronal mechanism. Yeah, subsets. And ideally, I assume, I hope in 20 years, some clever students pick this up and say, here, not of 4 mechanisms, you need 20 mechanisms, or you need to have subsets of mechanisms for each of these 4 mechanisms. Yeah. So that sort of see, and then you have different ways of studying, different kinds of experimental designs for the different mechanisms, different phenomenal features. So that's is spelled out. Let me give you one example to put a little bit more empirical flesh to the bones: the temporal spatial nestedness. Next one. Yeah, here, next one. Here I can already see, what do I mean by brain dynamics? So that's important. You have the data, you have an Indian background. You very well understand what I mean by dynamics. It's the patterns of change from time point to time point. I say that because they're real cultural differences. In the Anglo-American world, what for them dynamic means, okay, I just put all time points together. That's already dynamic. You see it in the experimental designs when you look into the method parts of the paper. Okay, I have dynamic, I just put in all time points. But that's not yet proper dynamic. Dynamic is the patterns of change from time point to time point that gives you a certain temporal continuity or discontinuity depending upon the pattern of change. And that's very important, because that means how can I measure these kinds of patterns. Let me give you an example here. Scale-free activity. So you have a brain, you have some raw data. You see upper left there in the middle. Then you see on the right, you see the decomposition into different frequencies. And what distinguishes the TTC approach from other Western consciousness approach, that it doesn't link consciousness to one particular frequency. That's not the case. Not one particular frequency, but to the structure of the relationship between the different frequencies. So how can you measure that? That you can measure, for instance, lower left in what you mean by scale-free activity. You have the same pattern across different frequencies, and you have the typical curve. You see lower left, you see power on the y-axis, frequency on the x-axis, both in logarithmic versions. And typical, you have much more power in the slow waves than in the faster waves. That's typical. Go to the seaside, you see the same. You're afraid of the big waves, they smash you back to the beach. The small waves, more frequent, you're not afraid of them. Yeah, and that you can measure in the frequency, which for a domain, which for instance the power law exponent, and you can measure that also in the time domain with the autocorrelation window. I will come back to that later. So that's we use these and various other measures, particularly from signal processing, from engineering, and from physics. The autocorrelation window, they have been used in neuroscience, but not so much. So that's the kind of way. So we do not look for single frequencies or single regions. I will come back to that later. But really for the structure of between the different frequencies. Next one. Yeah, and that leads me to temporal spatial nestedness. I showed you the power law exponent, how you can measure that in that scale-free activity, meaning you have self-similarity of the structure of the power spectrum across different frequencies. And now the question is, and that's basically nestedness. I always like to bring the examples of the Russian dolls, one doll in another, all the same shape, but different sizes. That's basically the same kind of nestedness, and that's why we speak of temporal spatial nestedness. So that's a phenomenon of nature. You see scale-free dynamic all over in music, in seismic earth waves, in stock markets, in sea waves, and everything. And here the same in the brain has been shown. But now the question, how is that related to consciousness? Next one. And you can have such, next one. So this is the paper, I show you some data which we did in anesthesia. Jianfeng Zhang, a Chinese student who's now a professor in Shenzhen in China. He investigated in fMRI anesthetic patients. Next one. And he investigated, indeed, next one, yeah, next one. He investigated the power law exponent, scale-free activity in the slow frequency. This is fMRI, so this is a frequency domain of 0.01 Hertz to 0.1 Hertz. And you see a huge decrease, the more blue in the upper pictures, a huge decrease in the PLE. The anesthetic brain is completely blue. The awake brain is the same subjects, awake and anesthetic state. You see it's red, so it's a high PLE in the awake state, and in the anesthetic state is completely broken down. And that's what you see lower left. The lower left is particularly interesting here. Look, the blue curves is the anesthetic subject. The red curve is the healthy subject, the awake subject. And you see basically the structure of the power spectrum with slower frequencies in the with more power in the slower frequency, less power in the faster frequency is completely broken down. The power spectrum is flat. And we have another paper in preparation where we replicated that in an independent data set. And interestingly, in the sedated state, this is the data which we are about to submit, in the sedated state, you still have the preservation of the structure of the power law. But here, in the blue case, the anesthetic brain, the brain has absolutely no power structure. Yeah. And so meaning it has no way of structuring also, for instance, input processing. And you see on the left, you see significantly, lower right, significantly higher PLE in the wake than in the anesthetic state. So meaning the basic structure, the basic dynamic structure of the brain is broken down. It's no longer nestedness between the different frequencies. Yeah, there's no scale-free dynamic. Next one. Yeah, then the question is that specific? Because that's another issue in problem in the current theories of consciousness, that they only usually test one variable, but one measure. But do you know whether that is specific? So here Jianfeng Zhang, who was a postdoc at the time with me, he did a very clever thing. He said, it's not just PLE, a power law exponent, but maybe we also need to look for variability. So he calculated the variability for the expert, the root mean square of the amplitude. And you see again, quite a remarkable decrease in variability. It's not as strong as in the PLE. But now the question is, it's just specific? Is the PLE specific or unspecific? Next one. Yeah. Then the question is, which one is relevant for consciousness? Power law exponent or SD? Is it just the variability? Or is it really the structure of the power spectrum measured by the PLE? So then he correlated SD and PLE. First, lower left, you can see that in the wake state, they had a high correlation. Of course, this makes sense because the PLE is also based on the fluctuations of the power spectrum. However, in the anesthetic state, lower left, you can see it doesn't correlate anymore. So meaning, in the anesthetic state, when you lose consciousness, the structure of the power spectrum, remember it was completely flat, is detached from the variability. So then he did the opposite, which was a very clever idea. Then he correlated the PLE in the awake state with the PLE anesthetic state, always in a voxel-based way. And you see in the PLE doesn't correlate anymore between awake and anesthetic state, but the SD, the variability, still correlates, lower right. So that strongly suggests what specifically changes is the structure of the power spectrum, and that is relevant for the loss of consciousness. So next slide. Yeah, here you see a spatial dissociation between PLE and SD across awake and anesthetic states, meaning only PLE but not SD may be necessary for consciousness. Next one. So now the question is, how can you further provide some evidence for that? So for that, he did a very clever thing. Now he did sort of an intersubjective based correlation. Next one. So the first thing what he did, he correlated the PLE between all awake subjects with the PLE in the anesthetic subjects. So it was in the two different states. So, and you can see that in the PLE among the awake subjects correlated highly with each other. You see upper left, PLE awake with PLE awake subject. So you and I are both awake. We have a high correlation in our topography voxel-based PLE. However, when I turn anesthetic, as I was before when I couldn't upload the slides, then, and you're still awake, you were very awake because you tried to instruct me, then my PLE, topography of the PLE, doesn't correlate anymore with your topography of the PLE. So that suggests it's really the dynamic and the topography of the dynamic have changed. Now, next one. Now you want to see how is it for SD? The SD was reduced, but the topography of the SD remained. You can see that this here. You see the SD of the awake, the SD of the anesthetic, they still have a high intersubject, still an intersubject correlation there. Next one. So meaning it is really the topographical distribution of the dynamic of the PLE, which is key here, and not just the variability. Next one. So what does this amount to? So this means there is a temporal spatial nestedness, because that's what scale-free dynamic describes. Sorry for the typo up there in the nestedness. This is not a Freudian slip. That is related to the level of state of consciousness. Look in the lower part of this figure, we see what we show, the PLE breaks down. What does the PLE mean? It means different time scales. You have the shorter time scales, you see lower left, the milliseconds integrated within the second. You have the second embedded or nested within the minutes. The minutes are embedded or nested within the hours and so forth. So you have a quite sophisticated pyramid of different time scales, and that's your scale-free dynamic. And you see, we also plotted the Russian dolls on top. Now, that's on the left. Now, when you start losing consciousness, your time scales are minimized. Usually your power spectrum shifts more towards the slower frequencies at the expense of the faster. That's the middle state where you remember, you look some middle time scales are missing, the slower time scales become abnormally strong, meaning your bigger Russian dolls become abnormally big. Now on the very right, lower right, you completely lose any structure of your power spectrum, meaning it's completely blank. Yeah, that's complete flat. You make no difference anymore between shorter and longer time scales because your brain has no structure anymore, meaning you cannot perceive and relate to your external environment, meaning you lose consciousness. So that's temporal spatial nestedness on the temporal side. The upper part, which I didn't explain, how about on the spatial side? It's the same thing. You have smaller regions nested within the network, networks nested within other networks, these other networks nested within the whole brain topography. That has been described, for instance, by graph theoretic measures. What we here used, the upper right, we used global signal topography, global functional connectivity, that's basically global synchrony. And we could really see that the lower your globally distributed brain activity, the lower your level of consciousness. We showed that in anesthesia and sleep, as well as in coma, in fMRI, as well as even in rat anesthesia. We had those data. That's the upper right, Tanabe et al. 2020. So you could really see that the global functional connectivity and its distribution, nestedness in single regions, is related directly to the level state of consciousness. So that's sort of the hypothesis that we assume temporal spatial nestedness is a key mechanism of the level of state of consciousness. And it basically adds on the phenomenal level, as you see in the lower part particular, to the temporal and spatial differentiation of your perception and cognition. And if you lose that, you lose consciousness. Yeah. Then, so we imagine that they perceive their own inner mental life as well as the outer environment completely blank, like the lower right. Next one. Yeah. So that's one mechanism, temporal spatial nestedness. Another one, and I think that really distinguishes the TTC from all others, is temporal spatial alignment. So what do I mean by that? It's a linking to the environmental context. So, and this is the key conceptual issue here, that there is always a neuroecological, neurosocial, neurocultural dimension to consciousness. Only if your brain synchronizes with the environmental context, you can become conscious. Typical example, music. You synchronize with the rhythm of the music, and your brain rhythm synchronizes with the rhythm of the music. That's what I mean by alignment. And that's very important. The brain aligns its own inner dynamic and ultimately even its topography to the external dynamic and topography of the environment. That's absolutely key. It's always that direction. Yeah, because what do you perceive in consciousness? You perceive yourself as part of the larger environment. Yeah, you have what philosophers call a point of view. We have a whole paper upon that, upon just the point of view, which basically virtually locates you within the environment, gives you a certain spatiotemporal stance with your own spatiotemporal range relative to the much larger spatiotemporal range of the environmental context. So next one. Yeah, that's temporal spatial alignment. And here I want a particular form, again, that's a distinct mark of the TTC, that in addition to level state and content, it assumes a third dimension of consciousness, that's the form. So your consciousness always has a certain organization. When you go back to the Gestalt psychology, they speak of figure and background. A recent paper of ours speaks of foreground and background measures. And this foreground and background is key. When you perceive, for instance, me here via Zoom, sorry, it's Teams. Yeah, you perceive me via Teams, you perceive me against a certain background. And that background is created by your own brain. And the way your background in your brain and your perception interacts with me as the incoming input, that determines how you will perceive me. Yeah? If your inner background, your spontaneous ongoing activities dynamic and its inner cognition are extremely strong, you might notice me, but you will not really listen to me, because you basically continue to dwell on in your own thoughts, which might be a little bit deviated in their topic, but ultimately you remain within your thing. Yeah. So that's why we see there's a certain structure or form of consciousness. This is the key thing. Next one. Yeah. So I show you one. So the direction in which the TTC goes is that we subdivide each mechanism into submechanisms or different layers. One layer I show you here is the intrinsic neural timescales. So how do you align to your environment? When you listen to music or you listen to me, there's a certain temporal structure you pick up. You have windows. You have time windows. You have temporal windows. If you have a larger window, you have a longer autocorrelation window, and you perceive much more. If you have a smaller window, you perceive much less, but much more detail. Yeah. So, and how can we measure these windows of the brain? With the intrinsic neural timescales, in particular the autocorrelation function or window, ACW, as it's called. We had 2 reviews paper, last year, this one in Trends in Cognitive Science. I will show that. And here, lower left, you can measure this autocorrelation window. You basically look for the time lags. You correlate the signal at T1 with the signal at T2, T3, T4, and so forth, and then the same for T2 with T3, T4, and blah, blah, blah. And then you get time lags, and then you get a certain signal correlation. And of course, the lower the temporal, the shorter the temporal distance between different time points in your signal, of course, the higher the correlated, and the longer the temporal distance between signal points, of course, the less correlation. So that's an autocorrelation. That's how it is called. You see lower left, and the standard is to measure it at 50% of the correlation, how long your window is. That's the ACW 50. And we here also introduced a clever engineer from Iran in my group, Meshad Golozorki. He introduced ACW 0. Basically, you see this here when the curve hits the zero line, the zero correlation. And we see on the right, you also see very important, you see a certain topographic distribution. You usually see longer temporal windows in the default mode network, cortical midline structure, shorter windows in the primary sensory cortex. Next one. Yeah, so here we said, how is this, are these temporal windows related to consciousness? So this is an EEG study by Federico Ciglio, postdoc of mine, who is in Italy, from Italy, and he did an extensive EEG study. You will see that intrinsic neural timescales, how are they changing consciousness? And particularly, he was interested in, are they related to sensory or motor processing? You will see this. I come to the data. Next one. Yeah, so here he showed he conducted both. He did also the power law exponent in the frequency domain, autocorrelation window in the time domain. And here you see the sleep data, and you see lower left, so upper left you see the typical autocorrelation window with the time lags. Upper right you see the typical scale-free power law exponent. Lower left you see the autocorrelation window, and it's quite nice. You see basically a parametric prolongation when you go from awake state to N3 and N1 and 2 and 3. Always the autocorrelation gets a little longer. You see the same in the PLE side, meaning you strengthen your slower frequencies, yeah, at the expense of your faster frequencies. Meaning the slower frequencies take much more room. Remember the little gimmicks I showed than the faster frequencies. And interesting REM, particularly associated with dreams, you see a slight lowering of the PLE and also a shortening of the ACW, but not as much in the awake state. So that already we see, okay, there's abnormally long autocorrelation window. And then we showed this same in the anesthesia. These are EEG data. Next one. Yeah, here you see EEG data, both in anesthesia, sevoflurane and ketamine. You see on the left the ACW autocorrelation window, and you see sevoflurane significantly prolongs the window, ketamine too, but not as strong. Same on the PLE side. Next one. Next one. So now the question is this related to sensory input processing or motor output processing? So if it's related just to sensory input processing, the ACW and the PLE should be normal in those conditions where you have a motor deficit. And you can study that. There's a very unfortunate condition, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, and these patients preserve their consciousness but cannot move at all. They can usually move their little eye blink, then you can do some brain-computer interface for communication because they're fully conscious inside, but they cannot move, they cannot talk, and so forth. And you have an even more unfortunate condition, complete locked-in syndrome, where they don't even have the eye movements, where you cannot do brain-computer interface. So now, if in this motor deficiency condition, the PLE and the ACW are abnormal, then you would say maybe it's both. They affect both motor output processing and sensory input processing. However, that was not the case. We could show in these cases a normal length of the autocorrelation window. Albeit indirectly, this let us suggest that maybe particularly the ACW is especially relevant for input processing. Next slide. And that input processing is particularly relevant for consciousness. Next one. So here we give you a summary. You see, basically you see in the sensory deficits, which are clearly there in these disorders of consciousness, when you reduce consciousness, you have an abnormal slow wave. You see that there in the middle. Whereas in motor deficits, preserved sensory function in these ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, and locked-in syndrome, you don't see a change in the frequency. So if you have, so now the question, so that's a possible neuronal mechanism, but now the question how that translates into the phenomenal features of consciousness. So if you have too long time scales, you might have too much temporal integration. So if your windows are too long, you see too much, but you don't see the details anymore. So you have an abnormal temporal integration at the expense of temporal segregation. So you have no alignment to the world's faster timescales anymore. Everything is the same. World becomes one big black box. Loss of consciousness. Next one. And I show you this one. So the question is, what are the neural functions of these timescales? So as we assume, this is the recent paper in TICS, which we just published, temporal integration and segregation of inputs. And let me show you the next slide. And that's why we have different timescales. You see this in the lower parts of this one. The brain has different timescales. And by those timescales, the brain can optimally adapt and stochastically match with the abundance of timescales in the environmental context, which is key for input processing. Next one. Yeah, here you see. So now, is this really, are longer timescales really in charge of temporal integration? So this is the simulation in a neural network model, Chowdhury et al. 2015 Neuron, which we picked up here. And we presented different kinds of input to the system. So this is a network model with an intrinsic hierarchy, unimodal regions, transmodal regions, like here 24C. You see the different regions from visual cortex 1 over V4 and so on, or the other visual regions, and then to 24C, highest region, part of the default mode network. And you see, for instance, when we see upper left, we present a short input, and you see the activity induced in V1, visual cortex 1, primary visual cortex, is really mirrors the temporal distribution of the input. However, you see in 24C, when you go down the regions, you see a much longer activity, which is no longer related to the timing of the inputs. So you really see a temporal integration of the three inputs in the red signal of 24C. And you see this lower left is basically the same thing. It's just presented that basically the three inputs are represented as three different inputs in V1 temporally, but not in 24C. So you have a high temporal segregation in V1 in unimodal regions and a high temporal integration in default mode regions like 24C. On the right, you can see the same thing. You see now it's for long input. So you see again the long input, the temporal duration is well mirrored in V1, but it's hugely extended in 24C. So when I make a gesture like this, your visual cortex and probably your motor cortex will very much follow my movements. Whereas your default mode network, yes, it will pick up, but it basically will smooth the different movements into one activity change. Yeah, so that's temporal integration. And you see lower right, we also calculated the autocorrelation windows for V1 and 24C, and you see the huge difference, much longer windows. So that really suggests the neuronal mechanism of this autocorrelation window is temporal integration segregation. Now you ask, that's the neuronal mechanism for temporal spatial alignment for input processing. Now, next slide, you ask for the neurophenomenal mechanism. So this is what we're, next one, what we're currently testing. So I can only give you some a sketch, some hypothesis here. So look, it's a very nice figure which was done by my co-author in this paper, Federico Zilio, the postdoc from Italy. And because he makes such nice figures, I call him Federico da Vinci. So here, what is now the neurophenomenal implications of these longer timescales? So look upper left. So you have, here's this you have temporal integration segregation. You perceive, for instance, Here, a policeman and a thief. The policeman is following the thief and says, stop, please, police, stop right now. You'll never, and the other guy says, you'll never catch me. So you see different words. Each word requires a particular time scale, but you also need to put the words together. So you need longer and shorter time scales. Yeah, and that's what you see. You have corresponding event segmentation with temporal integration segregation. So you need to segregate the different words, but you also need to integrate them. Your brain has a myriad of different time scales for that. Now, if these time scales change, your perception of the scene will change. Let's say you lose, like when you lose start losing consciousness, like N1 or N2, you lose your shorter time scales. Yeah, remember, your ACW becomes longer, you lose the faster frequency, your PLE becomes higher. Upper right, then you see it becomes a little blurred. You cannot perceive everything anymore, and the perception becomes a little blurred, and also the words cannot be properly segregated anymore. Now, if you continue that, you lose even more of your faster time scales. Lower left, your picture becomes even more blurry, and you cannot decipher, barely decipher the speech. And if you completely lost consciousness, like lower right, it's completely blurred and you cannot perceive the speech anymore. That's why we assume that when you start losing consciousness, your perception becomes literally black, undifferentiated, becomes one big global soup. So this is something we're currently testing in intermediate states of consciousness and link that directly to the duration of the ACW. Next one. Yeah, here's another example. So this is from our TICS paper where we gave the example of a robot. This has huge implications for artificial intelligence because you want your artificial agents to have different timescales. Here we gave you an example. So you see in the upper part, that's the way the brain works. It has unimodal and transmodal. It's a gradient from unimodal regions, primary sensory regions, to more transmodal regions, and at the apex is the default mode network. And the transmodal regions have much longer timescales. You see this upper right than the unimodal regions. Yeah, so there's a gradient for that, and we can really show this. We showed this, and others confirmed that in both MEG and fMRI. So both the whole frequency range applies that. Now, if your robot, now we go to the B figure, to the lower part. So if your robot, if you build into your robot only faster timescales, but not the slower ones, it will perceive the music only the faster timescales of the music. So your robot will dance too fast to the music. Now, if your robot has only slower timescales, but not the faster ones, then your robot will move too slow. And if your robot has all the timescales which you present in your environmental context, like in the music, then it will move properly. Interestingly, this is not a science fiction scenario. We see this as a psychiatrist. In depression, you're too slow because your slower timescales predominate, meaning you have too long autocorrelation window, particularly in the transmodal regions. Yeah, I don't show this data here, and meaning they dance too slow. And that's literally what you see. You see psychomotor retardation. They are too slow. Yeah, and in mania, it's the opposite. Next one. So you see the importance for the times of the brain's timescale for the interaction with the environment. So here we compared the TTC with the IIT. So this is an important point because when you look at the current theories of consciousness, basically none of them considers time. Yeah, meaning different time scales. So the IIT operates on a very short time scales. You see the graph on the upper, but between 30 and 100 and 300 milliseconds. That's where the IIT operates. But it does not consider longer time scales. And let's say from minutes, let alone longer. Yeah, that's what we see. And this is important because consciousness requires the different time scales, short, long. The more differentiated, the better, because the better it can match with the environmental context time scales. So meaning, this is also an important issue here, that the TTC does not consider itself in contradiction to the other theories of consciousness. You may have heard that this adversarial competition against theories by the Templeton Foundation. I'm not a big friend of that, because I think you need to integrate each theory of consciousness described as relevant aspects. I would never deny that, but you need to integrate it into larger context. And I think that the TTC can provide such a context. Here we explicate that for the relationship to the IIT. Next one. Yeah, here it's another interesting, very, very interesting implication. We spelled that out in that review paper lower right there. So different species have different timescales. Here, this is schematically drawn. Rats, mice, cats, monkeys, humans have different timescales. And that means if you have more timescales, you have a higher chance of matching with the timescales of your environmental context. Meaning you have a higher chance of temporal spatial alignment to your environmental context. If you hear music in a rhythm which your brain cannot pick up, you will not perceive it. The typical example in philosophy of mind is, what is it like to be a bat? Thomas Nagel. A bat has ultrasonar waves. That is a completely different timescales which we as humans don't have. So meaning we cannot perceive ultrasonar waves as such without certain instruments. Yeah. So meaning the scope, the range of consciousness of the bat is slightly different than ours. So I would say the more similar different species in their timescales, the more similar the range or the spatiotemporal range or scope of their consciousness. And the more different is clear. And the more timescales you have, the better you can align and synchronize with your environmental context. That goes without default. So it enlarges the scope of your consciousness. So it has huge implications then also for different species. Next one. And of course, for robots, you can build in different timescales. So the main idea, the mechanism, and we're currently exploring that in various studies, behind temporal spatial alignment is that there's a stochastic-dynamic matching. So your timescales, your inner rhythms of the brain are matched with the rhythm of the music. For instance, if your inner timescales are too slow, like in depression, you will not be able to synchronize, align with fast music. That's exactly what you see in depressed patients. So that is really a stochastic matching, and that's the timescales of the mind provide the windows for such a matching. Yeah, the more windows, the better. The more differentiated your windows are, the better you can match with the different kinds of timescales of your environmental context. Next one. Yeah, I think I already clear that the brain's intrinsic neural timescales may correspond to the timescales of the environment. There's probably also an evolutionary shaping. I don't want to go into that, but this is key, and that is, for me, the key mechanism of temporal spatial alignment. And without that, you will not be able to develop consciousness, because consciousness is about experience yourself as part of the wider world. You sort of virtually locate yourself within the world as part of the world as whole. I'm sure with your strong Indian meditation background, you have a sense of what I mean, or probably you know much better than I do. Yeah, so that's key. And I think that's a key mechanism which distinguishes the TTC from all the other theories. Next one. Conclusion. Next one. Yeah, next one. Yeah, here we sketch again the temporal spatial theory compared, and I don't want to go into detail. But here we plot, you see lower right, you see the different mechanisms plotted, and you see different conditions. You see wakefulness, psychedelics, schizophrenia, anesthesia. So of course, in any theory of consciousness, must be able to differentiate between these different states. Why? Because these different states can be characterized by slightly different phenomenal features. This is key. We need to have a much more fine-grained neuroscientific account to account for the fine-grained phenomenological difference in these states. And I'm sure that even the form mechanism of the TTC is just the beginning. My hope that, as I said earlier, in 20 years, that each of the mechanisms will be split off into 20 sub-mechanisms. Yeah, these are just umbrella concepts, and way too unspecific, scientifically speaking. Yeah, but, and I hope that also from the phenomenological side. So now we are developing these temporal spatial approaches to different kinds of states, for dream, for meditation, for psychiatric disorders, for, you saw the disorders of consciousness. So because you need to see how the phenomenological differences match, as I would say, are related to spatial-temporal topographic dynamic differences. Yeah, and we also probe for time-space experience on consciousness itself. For instance, we develop a time-space experience scale for schizophrenia. Next one. Yeah, the next one. You already know that, I already pressed this. And the key, one conceptual key assumption is really that spatial-temporal features, why spatial-temporal features? That spatial-temporal features are shared by neuronal and mental level. So if your spatial-temporal features on the neuronal side are in an extreme range, they may not transform into mental features. Yeah? So meaning you will not have consciousness. You need a certain range, you need a certain number of windows, temporal windows. If you have only slow windows, your consciousness will decrease. If you have only fast windows, your consciousness will decrease. That's what phenomenology shows. And so you need an optimal range of in the dynamic, let's say, in the time windows. And that translates into corresponding experience of time. Next one. Yeah, clear. I already said that. You know that in the Western world they discuss this heart problem or explanatory gap problem. That's a gap, an intrinsic gap, a gap between brain, between neuronal and mind, neuronal and phenomenal activity. The answer for that is clear. The common currency is the answer to that. Is shared. It bridges the gap. It provides a necessary intrinsic connection between brain and consciousness. Next one. And next one. That what leads us in the 2020 paper, we speak of what we call spatiotemporal neuroscience. And this is very important. It does not exclude cognitive neuroscience, but I would say it puts it on a wider framework. So the brain function is just one specific subset of the much more enlarged brain dynamics. There's a lot of brain dynamics going on which is not associated with cognition. So cognition or brain function, as described here, is just the tip of the iceberg. But I don't need to tell you, the iceberg is much larger, it goes beneath the water, and you don't see that. That is all hidden. And that's where brain dynamics come. So it's a spatiotemporal shaping, and I hope I indicated that a little bit, a spatiotemporal shaping of perception and cognition. And that's why we say, look, spatiotemporal neuroscience might complement, might provide an umbrella framework for all the other disciplines. Next one, and I think that's the last one. Yeah, that's my last one. So I hope that I could make some sense to the idea that the temporal spatial theory of consciousness and our approach to consciousness, which also has huge philosophical implications, which I spell out in the book upper right. And I hope that that's really a spatial temporal shaping of consciousness, and I would be very eager to see and hear how does that, for instance, fare in your traditions, and how you link that, or whether you can make sense of that. Thank you very much, and also thank you very much, and sorry for the problems with the slides in the team. Thanks for shifting things. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Northoff, for this really integrative talk. Now I invite the audience to ask questions if they have any. Any questions from the audience? Please ask. Okay, so we have got a question from Professor Bakchi.
Thank you very much, Professor Northoff, for this pretty amazing, synoptic kind of talk. I have been working on very specific aspects of cognition in dance, and there were several points at which, without being technically savvy enough, I was able to kind of connect your work, aspects of your work, with issues in cognition of dance, cognition including activity in dance. But that also kind of got me thinking about another aspect of activity, or very specialized kind of activity, namely meditation. Although this work is the work that I would like to cite is perhaps now a bit dated, I would nonetheless like to pose the question to you regarding the kind of difference in relating to the environment that V.S. Ramachandran and his team found in the case of the brains of meditating people, specifically monks, but people who had become habituated to meditating or getting into very steady meditative states. So would you care to react to that, since this is an issue that kind of now bridges across East and West also? Thank you.
Yeah, very good question, and I will answer to both, so I'm very grateful for the question. First, for me, let's say, start with the dance, because it's a beautiful example of temporal spatial alignment. So I expect that you have phase-based synchronization here. Yeah, that let's say if you present your music in a certain, let's say, theta alpha rhythm, that the phase cycles of your alpha theta rhythm phase synchronize and train by the corresponding alpha theta rhythms of your music. Yeah, and probably you have different layers of phase alignment. That's for sure. That could be one level of studying that. That would be, for me, phase-based synchrony as one example of temporal spatial alignment, which I didn't go into detail here. Okay. You see, for instance, that phase-based alignment, you can measure that, I don't need to tell you, intertrial phase coherence in EEG and MEG. You see that reduced in schizophrenia. And indeed, schizophrenic patients are absolutely desynchronized with their environmental content. So that would be another mechanism of temporal spatial alignment besides the temporal windows, the autocorrelation window I presented here. There you already see temporal spatial alignment has different sub-mechanisms, different neuronal mechanisms. And you mentioned yet another one, meditation. Just get back. And if you're, for instance, too slow, and you see this in my psychiatric patients, if you're too slow and depressed are too slow, they cannot follow the rhythm of the dead. They always lag behind. Yeah, and in mania, you can imagine they're too fast. Yeah. So you see, I operate on a very basic dynamic level for this dancing. Yeah, so I would be interested in what you do on the cognitive side, because if you use more cognitive measures, both psychologically and neuronal, I would say that maybe my dynamic measures should predict your cognitive measures. That's the idea. Yeah, because you have a dynamic or temporal shaping of your perception and cognition of the dance. Yeah, that's why I'm going to this very deeper dynamic level. Remember my second to last slide here. I think, no, I don't have the control over the slides. I wanted to push the slide. Yes. Yeah. Then the second question is the meditation. That's of course yet another. So I should rather stop. So we have a paper in revision on a topographic reorganization theory of meditation. What do we mean by that? So usually you have a gradient between unimodal and transmodal regions. You have the same sensory input. That sensory input is processed in unimodal regions like V1 or auditory cortex 1 and blah, 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 blah. And then it's basically progressed and processed again in higher order regions like default mode network. Yeah. However, the default mode network has much longer timescales. It has been shown than the unimodal regions. So that means that the same input is now processed in a different neuronal context, meaning it's associated with, let's say, your inner thoughts instead of perceptions. Now, what we observe in the meditation, and we did a meta-analysis of the fMRI studies, there's an abundance of findings in meditation, as you know, and a lot of contradictory finding in different meditations, different methods, and so on and so forth. However, what is relatively consistent that you have a decrease in DMN activity, and that is no longer as prominently different from, for instance, unimodal input regions. So what we assume, and we link that to a certain phenomenological feature, that might be that we perceive ourselves more in a non-dual way. Non-dual awareness, which is by Josipovic, a guy in New York, who makes that very strong, as distinguished from this dual self-world dualism, which we usually have, which may be predisposed by our brain's topography and its dynamic with slow and short timescales. And if that difference, basically between unimodal and transmodal processing, falls apart, tilts toward unimodal processing, you might not make such a difference between yourself and the external context, between internal and external, between self and world. Yeah, and that I think would fit nicely with the non-dual phenomenology.
Right.
So the general idea how topography and dynamic shapes your mental features, your consciousness. You see, I don't revert to any cognitive mechanism because they're secondary for me. Yeah.
I see. Thank you very much.
Any other questions from the audience? Any other questions from the audience? Okay, so before the audience get to ask some other questions, I thought of asking my own. The first question is related to the gradation that you have shown in your results, gradation of nestedness, right? Nestedness of timescales, and as you have shown that that nestedness degrades or becomes almost non-existent as consciousness or the level of consciousness goes down. Now, have you conducted any study with patients having going into brain death or coma, showing the kind of activity that sort of confirms your predictions?
You mean in coma patients and vegetative?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I see. I presented anesthesia sleep data. You're right, but we often have also a coma group. The problem with the coma group, unresponsive wakefulness state, as it's called these days, is that they often have brain lesions. So you don't really know what is the effect of the loss of consciousness and what is the effect of the brain lesion. So the way we get out that we say we only take those with minimal brain lesions. Yeah. But in general, the pattern is the same for all three groups. Yeah. So for all three, coma, unresponsive wakefulness, sleep, and anesthesia. And that's a general, and that in turn then says, okay, it must be really related to the loss of consciousness rather than to some state-specific condition, like the anesthetic drug, or though there are differences in anesthesia between different drugs, or the lesion. Yeah, but that's of course an indirect inference. But no doubt, the all the things I said is sort of confirmed for all three conditions. I can say that. What we currently do not really have, and we're working on that because it's sometimes very difficult to get task-related data when you have unconscious people. You just do a resting state. But you need to have task data in order to show the temporal spatial alignment. So we're working on that. And indeed, one thing which I can say here, which is interesting, which is in preparation, that you usually have an encoding of the task periodicity. Let's say if you present a block design, let's say you present a block design in 20 seconds, 20 second on, 20 second off, 20 second on, 20 second off. Then you see corresponding, you see frequency power, you see power changes in corresponding frequency ranges. Yeah. So let's say if you have a 10 second, you see you have a 10 second on, 10 second off, 10 second on. You have an increase in 0.1 hertz power, and you can really see this. So your brain encodes the task periodicity. Yeah. And of course, again, if you have more time scales, you can encode more task periodicity. Yeah. And now we show that that task periodicity is no longer there encoded when you're in an anesthetic state. In a sedated state, it's still there. That's data in preparation. Yeah. So it's really related to temporal spatial alignment. It's still there when you're sedated, but it's just a little slower, but a little bit more clouded. Yeah. But you're still somewhat synchronized with your environment. It's all a little slower, a little more blurry, but you're still there. Yeah. But when you lose consciousness, goodbye. That's it. You have no encoding of task periodicity anymore. So that's why I know it's a daring hypothesis, our first contact with the environment is not sensory based, it's temporal based, it's dynamic. The dynamic within the sensory organs. Yeah, and then later it becomes, of course, each sensory system may have slightly different dynamic, true, different time scales. Visual cortex time scales include more longer time scales than the auditory cortex time scales. No doubt, there's a difference. But that's probably due to some evolutionary shaping and the kind of stimuli we got. But I'm sure that now with all this phone stuff, our timescales will also change. Yeah. So the primary coding here might be really temporal, and I would say that that's key for consciousness. Yeah.
All right. So now I have another question which might take you far afield. But I'm still curious to ask that question. Since you touched on the comparison of nestedness across species,
Yeah.
I just wonder whether you could find any evidence of the kind of hierarchically elaborate spatiotemporal nestedness can exist in, let's say, plants, even though plants do not have any nervous systems, but they still have electrical activities in their phloem tissues.
Yeah, very, very interesting. When you look on my website, last year I gave a talk about artificial intelligence, and I remember the journalist afterwards in the interview asked me about plants, exactly that. Okay. So you hit a point here. Plants have time scales. They move. But they move much slower than we can perceive. Meaning we don't have the timescales of plants. Now, of course, the next question, and I know I will not answer that question, erase it. Do plants have consciousness? I will not answer that question, but I would give you a criterion from my side. If they have slow timescales, but not faster timescales, their extent of possible stochastic matching with the environmental context is extremely small. Yeah, you have a very small range, the slow range within which they connect to the environmental context. Whether that is sufficient to convert the slow dynamic into a phenomenal state with a corresponding dynamic, I don't know. Yeah, that's the moment where I would love, and we do this more and more, simulation and modeling. You saw I presented a little bit the simulation with the ACW, the temporal integration, and we use it more and more. Of course, all that is insufficient when it comes to the phenomenal features of consciousness, but I hope we can link that much more intricate in the next 2-3 years. Yeah, and how you want to study that in the plan is that. But what I would love to do, and I haven't gotten the context for that, that I would really love to do, let's say, do the different species, let's say cats, mice, monkeys, and humans, with, let's say, fMRI or EEG or recording, intracranial recording. So same method for all of them, and for all the same, let's say, visual paradigm. With this, let's say we present a visual paradigm with different kinds of temporal structures, following the temporal windows of those species. And then the hypothesis is clear. I would love to conduct that study, yeah, but I haven't gotten the context for that yet.
I think that would perhaps help implement the vision that you have, because if spatiotemporal nestedness is the key currency of all kinds of activities, including the ones which are reckoned to be cognitive. So it will be interesting to see whether that basis is to be found in other organisms which are not classically or traditionally examined by most biologists or neuroscientists. Plants are, of course, one of them, because I mean, I think study of plants is most ignored in current cognitive science.
Right, right. Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. I mean, you raised a good point. Maybe the degree of nestedness is not sufficient, because for nestedness to have, you need a repertoire, a range of different timescales. Otherwise, if you have only 2 Russian dolls, it's too limited. Yeah, you need a different. So, yeah, but that can be studied. I agree with that. And of course, relative to the environmental context in which they move. That's key, because the main criterion is not just the number of timescales, but how do the number of timescales allow a stochastic matching with the environmental context. That makes consciousness possible for me. I think that's very key for me.
I think the second part of your theory, spatial environment alignment, I suppose that would play a key role here, because plants are spatially stagnant, right?
Yeah.
And whereas other species are locationally mobile, they can move around.
Yeah. Another example is trees. Trees are very interesting. I'm working on a book for Elsevier on spatiotemporal neuroscience, and I go into nature for all kinds of examples just to show the analogy that the brain is nothing special. So trees are very interesting because they use their roots to get all the metabolites. Yeah, so there is a dynamic, and they, of course, spatially completely static. Yeah, but it's a very interesting example. Yeah, so they aligned. They show temporal spatial alignment through their roots, and there's a dynamic in those roots. And I mean, here in Canada, I mean, it's breathtakingly cold in winter, and they survive. Yeah, hundreds of years. It's incredible. Yeah.
Right. Thank you for your reply. So if there are any questions from the audience, they may still ask. I think we have got a question. Please go ahead.
Hello, am I audible? Hello, Professor. My name is Sanjukta, and I'm working in humanities discipline from the IIT Roorkee. Currently, I'm working in memory studies discipline. So my question to you is regarding the memory and the spatiotemporal consciousness, and how it has an implications upon the migrated psyche of individuals or community. If you could elucidate further in this regard, because I have limited knowledge about the neurocognitive sciences, so I would like to learn from you if you have some answer.
Yeah, good question. I mean, here you see, so I think usually often memory is I'm not an expert on the memory, but memory is often considered in a cognitive way. Yeah, so specific contents, autobiographical contents, heterobiographical contents, semantic contents, procedural contents. Yeah, working memory.
Yes.
So it's usually very, for me, this is, I would say, it's very content-based, very cognitive-based. For me, memory is primarily spatiotemporal. So if my hippocampus has too short windows, it will not be able to proper memory. So I would expect that if your hippocampus has, and the hippocampus itself, this was a paper by Raut et al. 2020, showed that has itself a certain hierarchy of timescales. Let's say if certain timescales in the hippocampus are missing, you might have problems in certain kinds of memory, for instance, trauma. Yeah, trauma affects the hippocampus through cortisol, is well known. And so for me, memory, again, like many other forms of cognition, are driven by the temporal structuring of, for instance, different timescales. Yeah. We are currently conducting a study on working memory, where we look the same, whether the timescales in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex predict the working memory performance. Yeah. So there's a temporal structuring, and memory is a paradigmatic example of temporal dynamic and temporal continuity. The longer your autocorrelation window in the hippocampus, the better you can probably memorize, and the more later you can go back to your earlier childhood. Yeah, probably psychotherapy might be here. Basically, you get access to your longer timescales, earlier stuff. Yeah, the unconscious, the famous unconscious psychoanalysis. Yeah, and that's what I would assume, and I think that it's a very clear prediction. And if you have the spatial temporal dynamic, now go one step further, because that is the domain where you're coming from. Now you say that if you have longer timescales in the hippocampus, those longer timescales integrate well with the longer timescales in your environmental context. There you have the cultural imprinting and the social impact. Yeah. So for me, rather than saying, okay, cultural influences, I need to go to cognition, and then I have a cognitive neuroscience of cultural impact, I go the other way. I go through the spatial time stuff, because I say that's the direct interface between the space-time features of the environmental context and the brain. That's where cultural neuroscience, where social impacts, cultural imprinting happens for me. So instead of on top, I put it right way to the bottom of the brain, where its own spatial temporal dynamic. And that's where consciousness is. Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir.
Any other questions from the audience? Any other questions? Please ask. No questions? Okay, so I think this is it. Thank you, Professor Northoff, for this really interesting and integrative talk. I think most of us enjoyed listening to you. And this is the end of the first day of the webinar. So we hope to have more talks from tomorrow. Okay.